I would like you guys to welcome my first panelist for the day, Dr. Nasser Saidi, who is the chairman of the MENA Clean Energy Business Council, to the stage, please. Well, the chair, the stage.
Here's right.
Yeah, please go for it. Okay, so we have 15 minutes. I don't know how much we're going to get into. I know we spoke a lot last week about, what we're going to discuss. And I guess my first question is something that Raed alluded to, and those are the challenges. I'm a journalist, so we love to ask about challenges to, all the people we speak to. But in your opinion, Dr. Raed, what do you think are the...
Nasser, that's right.
Dr. Nasser, what do you think are the primary challenges in transitioning to renewable energy in this region to mitigate climate change? I mean, we're hosting COP28. It's part of the discussion. So what do you think those are?
I think Raed really set the scene. And I have a wish for the Red Sea and NEOM that is going to be the showcase for how you address climate challenges, whether it's renewable energy or other aspects. Fundamentally, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that what you're talking about is a transformation of society and the way we work and the way we live. So the challenges are multiple. They're economic and technological. They are social and political. They are about innovation. They are about disruption. Many jobs will have to change and disappear. New jobs will get created. That's not going to happen easily. If you're talking about renewables, you're going to have the land available, say if you're looking at solar or even wind. How are you going to use that? What are you going to do about water systems? So it is very much holistic. And therefore, when you approach the issue, you need to think in terms of what are the policy priorities. And let me start off from where we are here today, and then I'll mention some of the policy priorities. The first thing to note in this part of the world, the rest of the world is talking about 1.5 degrees. We are already beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature in this part of the world. So in terms of the challenges and stresses, you're talking about water stress. 80% of the fresh water that we have in the region comes from outside the region. The Euphrates and the Nile are not in the region, they come from outside. You're talking about increased desertification because of higher temperatures, water rising, seawater rising, threatening many of the cities that we have. You're talking about the fact that many countries in the region don't have the resources. We're privileged in the GCC that we have the resources. You have the financial and you have access to technology, but many of the countries in the region do not. And that's going to raise issues not only in the region, but globally in terms of unequal access to technology and finance. And finally, a major challenge has to do with financing. If we are going to keep to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and I think I'm no longer a believer in what's called climate risk mitigation. Let me explain. Climate risk mitigation is what we talk about all the time, right? You invest in renewable energy, electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is to say, you're trying to minimize the risks of climate change. What I see is that we've gone beyond that. We need to start thinking about climate mitigation. And that means making massive investments to your infrastructure so it becomes climate resilient. So infrastructure services become climate resilient. If you saw what happened in Libya earlier this year, a couple of dams burst, right? Because they were badly maintained, badly designed, etc. Net result, 20,000 people lost their lives at the best estimate. If you saw what happened in Pakistan, massive rains, right? 30 million people got displaced. So what we're talking about is climate disasters. We are already we are already at climate tipping points. What do we mean by that? It means that the climate system itself might turn in a way that is no longer reversible. So climate risk mitigation is only a very small part. And even in that small part, let me mention what the challenges are. The estimates are that we need to spend something like $8.3 trillion between 2023, end of 23 to 2030, okay? Just on renewable energy. At least 50% of that is for emerging markets. Right? That's about easily 4 trillion, okay? So every year you're going to have to spend 1.2 trillion just for renewable energy development. And that's not the only bit. You're also going to have to invest in power grids. It's one thing to have a power plant or a solar plant, etc., but you have to relate it to the grids because you have to address the issue of intermittency and sustainability of the power source. And then you also have to think about, how do I store it? I've got the renewable energy. I've produced it through solar. How do I store it? Battery storage is going to become a massive issue. So there we're going to be talking about something like 720 gigawatts. Yeah. These are massive numbers that we're talking about. In terms of networks, grids, about 780 billion. These are massive numbers. So the question is, where do we get the finance from? The big challenge, I think, is that governments don't have the ability to finance that. Let's be very clear about that. By all estimates, something like 80% of the finance has to come from the private sector. The private sector will tell you, I'm happy to finance, but where's the framework? Give me a framework. Reduce the risk. What does that mean? It means that, come back to the priorities, what you need to do. Number one, you need to reduce climate fossil fuel subsidies across the world. Last year, the IMF estimates that subsidies, fossil fuel-related subsidies and their impact was over $7 trillion. That's because energy prices were high, right? $7 trillion. So you're going to have to reduce fossil fuel subsidies and convert the saving that you made from fossil fuel subsidies to investment in renewables and climate-resilient infrastructure. Number two, you have to introduce carbon pricing. Carbon pricing, not just reduce subsidies. You have to introduce carbon pricing, a carbon tax. That's about a minimum in this part of the world, about $8 per ton, yeah, CO2 emissions. Third, you have to have climate policies. And by climate policies, it means it has to be holistic and comprehensive. The UAE is one of the few countries in the world that actually has a minister in charge of addressing climate. Yeah. Why is that important? It's because addressing climate is a cross-cutting thing. It affects everything that government does because you care about society, the economy, public finances. And therefore, you need a climate policy which is comprehensive. If we talk about infrastructure, infrastructure by its very nature is long-term investment, 10, 15 years, maybe even longer. And therefore, you need to plan your fiscal policies, your debt management policies accordingly. And therefore, you cannot go from year to year. You cannot go from year to year. You have to think multiple years. And automatically, that means that if you make a commitment, and nearly all countries participating in COP28 are making net zero emission commitments, that's great. And we should applaud them and say, shukran, thank you very much, ahla wa sahla. But the problem I have is that many of us, I'd love to live much longer, but many of us are not going to be around in 2050. How do we make policymakers commit? There is the issue as an economist, there's this issue of time consistency of the policies. If you commit to a policy, will you continue committing to a policy and not change your mind somewhere down the line because there are elections happening, or there's another country that you want to fight, etc., etc. Look at what happened in the United States. When Trump administration took over, they reversed policies. So you might make a commitment today, and somebody else might change it.
You know, you're bringing up an excellent point, Dr. Nasser, you know, when it comes to addressing those challenges and real physical solutions to how, you know, to get through these challenges. But I'm just conscious of the time. I want to get, you know, a question about the region, and you've already spoken about that eloquently, but we live in a region that can be quite complex.
Yes,
and
it is.
I'm just, you know, I always wonder what are...
So let's get into it.
What are the solutions?
Right,
how can the private-public sector collaborate to sort of address this issue?
Okay, two main issues. For the GCC, you're highly dependent on fossil fuels, right? For some countries, it's a high share of GDP. It's an even higher share of government revenue. So automatically, you have to diversify your economy to reduce the risk from the fossil fuels. But in addition to that, given that you're highly dependent in terms of production, trade, and the like, and government revenue, you have to diversify across all three. That means that the transformation that is required in this part of the world is even more challenging than anywhere else, because if we talk about reducing fossil fuel subsidies, it means that much of industry and manufacturing that has been used to low energy prices will have to convert and start looking at higher energy prices. Now, the solution is to say, I'm going to provide you with solar, wind, and whatever at acceptable prices. So change your subsidies, go into renewable, make it easily accessible. And what helps you there is that the cost of technology has been rapidly reducing. So solar modules, battery prices, and all the rest are rapidly reducing. So what governments need to do is to create the framework. They need to tell them, I'm going to help you get access to finance. And I think this is the critical bit that we need, but which is achievable in this part of the world. We're right next to DIFC. ADGM is up the road. Saudi Arabia has KAFD. And these are centers for finance. So the one optimistic note I will make is the following. This part of the world, of course, is a major source of fossil fuel energy, oil and gas, and also hydrogen, because the technology is now available to us, and it's going to be available at even lower cost as time comes on. We know how to finance energy. We already do that. We've done so for the past 50, 60 years. The trick is to transfer part of that financing to finance renewable energy and clean technology. And that means that our financial centers have now got to be available for listing companies, for issuing green bonds and green sukuk, and blue ones if you like. I mean, if it's not green, then I'm happy to put if it's blue. Funds. So to me, the objective is very clear. We have to be the climate finance hub of the world, okay? But I think even that is not going to be sufficient, because people from the private sector are going to tell me, well, that's very nice, but who's going to take the risk? What I propose is there are many proposals for various funds. And COP28 has already achieved a lot by having a damage fund, promising 60 billion, maybe up to 100 billion. Excellent. But if you think about the numbers we were talking about, they're still very small compared to what we require. So I believe that this is the time for new institutions to be put in place. So I'm in favor of creating an international climate bank. Yeah? I wouldn't put it in the World Bank. I wouldn't put any fund, with all my due respect for the World Bank. I've dealt as a policymaker with all the international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, you name it, and for a long period of time. There's just too much politics and too much intervention. So we need an independent, mandated international climate bank, yeah, to provide the financing. Alongside it, I would have the equivalent of the IFC for the private sector, an international climate finance institute, which would also help finance the private sector. So you have to be able to do PPP. You need to provide finance to the private sector. You need to invest much more in climate tech. And here, I think, is another note of optimism. So let me come out and say, it just happens that this part of the world has been investing heavily in climate tech. And let me give you 3 examples, which are exportable examples. The first one is desalination.
Right.
The whole world is going to be under water stress. In this part of the world, the estimates are that by 2030, 80% of the population will be water stressed. If you go to Yemen today, the capital has run out of water. So desalination is going to be critical around the world to make water available to populations which are rapidly growing and becoming much more urbanized. Desalination, 50% of the world's capacity of desalination is in this region. And they're going to be adding some 37% more over the next 10 years. So desalination is number 1. The second one is district cooling. So we're sitting here, you don't see any ugly air conditioning units coming out of any of the offices as you do in most parts of the world. Why is that? Did you ask? More people didn't ask. That's because cold water is being piped into the buildings from a district cooling plant. So district cooling is going to be very big business as you go ahead. And that's another exportable technology because you've got rapid urbanization. And the third one is desert agriculture. We import in the region 85% of what we eat, what we consume, okay? If you have water stress and you don't have arable land, what are you going to do about it? What you need is desert agriculture. So that's a third technology which we have, which we can export to the rest of the world.
And those are essentially the 3 solutions that we spoke about before, and those are your 3 solutions to mitigate part of the solution to mitigate.
Apart from the massive investment in infrastructure resilience.
Absolutely. Again, conscious of the time, Dr. Nasser, thank you so much for those remarks. I know we can talk about this for hours. I mean, COP is happening. This is in the midst of the discussion. But just because I need to welcome my next panel discussion, thank you so much for those remarks, Dr. Nasser.